The fourth branch is the people's branch.
Senator, there's a problem at the essay contest. A little girl is losing faith in democracy.
A man named Glenn Fine was fired from his job in April 2020, and on that day it became crystal clear. The U.S. needs a fourth branch of government.
Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Democracy has been given a rebirth.
Today we're talking about people who get fired for doing their jobs, a massacre that took place in 1973, and how a fourth branch of government could have prevented all of that.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Senator Hatch, members of the Committee on the Judiciary.
Glenn Fine worked in one of the most essential jobs in the federal government, and there he was kind of like the Klay Thompson of public servants.
The most underrated just force in the league today.
Klay Thompson is that underappreciated.
His background, impeccable. This absolute smoke show was top of his class at Harvard while being captain of the men's basketball team. He was drafted by the San Antonio Spurs, but decided that instead of dishing alley-oops to David Robinson, he would go to law school. After graduating top of his class again and then being a successful lawyer, he could have done any number of jobs that would have made him $1 zillion. But instead, he decided that he wanted to be an inspector general. An inspector general works on behalf of the American people. They work within the federal government, investigating the federal government. And they look for things like waste and fraud and abuse of office. Most news outlets refer to them as government watchdogs. There are less than 100 inspector generals that work in the federal government, and they sniff out all sorts of funny business.
According to a new report from the Office of Inspector General, doctors realized they didn't have the right equipment for surgeries. In some cases, staff ran across the street to borrow supplies.
Stunning revelations in an Inspector General report saying police arranged sex parties for DEA agents.
If you're reading the news about how the federal government really messed up, chances are that it came from an Inspector General report. When Glenn Fine was fired, it was after decades of work as an Inspector General, and he was really good at his job. In the 2000s, he found abuses of the Patriot Act and wrongful searches of American citizens' phone records. He found counterterrorism ineffectiveness. He found failed gun-running sting operations.
The Justice Department's Office of the Inspector General reviewed the program and found major problems with intelligence sharing.
Inspector General Fine, or as his wife probably calls him, Glenn, he's so fine he blow my mind, worked for 4 presidents, and therein lies the issue. He worked for the president.
What's wrong with that?
I don't know. Yet.
What's wrong with that?
What's wrong with that?
Oh, fix the doorbell, Stanley.
Currently, there are 3 branches of government: the legislative, the executive, the judicial branches. Congress writes the laws, the president and his administration enforce the laws, and federal judges interpret the laws. Investigating criminal acts and public misconduct falls under the executive branch. But what happens when those investigators have to investigate one of their colleagues or even their boss? That's exactly what inspector generals are paid to do. That's their literal job description. Glenn Fine investigated the FBI under President Clinton, abuses of the Patriot Act under President Bush, and counterterrorism ineffectiveness under President Obama. And although they all had the power to do so, neither of them decided to fire Glenn Fine. He was inviting scandal and intrigue to their administrations, but he still got to keep his job because he was good at it. But for Glenn Fine, that took a turn in 2020.
Breaking news once again here at Fox News Washington. We have learned that the president has fired the intelligence community's Inspector General Michael Atkinson.
President Trump has fired another government watchdog.
Friday, April 3rd, Trump fired the Inspector General of the intelligence community. A few days later, he got rid of the Defense Department's IG. On Friday, May 1st, he said he was replacing the Health and Human Services Inspector General. Then this past Friday night, Trump fired State Department Inspector General Steve Linick.
In spring 2020, Trump ousted 5 inspector generals, Glenn Fine being one of them. And those inspector generals were investigating some pretty important stuff.
Linick may have been fired because he was investigating a controversial decision by Trump that cleared the way for military sales to Saudi Arabia.
It's set to be part of the oversight effort of this vast new federal stimulus effort.
But the issue is that Glenn Fine and the other inspector generals shouldn't have been fired from their posts. There wasn't an identifiable misconduct or underperformance. They were just doing their jobs. But it highlights a key flaw in the Constitution. The people who investigate government officials, including the president, are also the people who can be fired by those government officials, including the president. And we've had this happen throughout our history. In 1973, Richard Nixon was being investigated by a special prosecutor for doing crazy stuff, like using the CIA to suppress a criminal investigation into his political campaign. And when Nixon was being investigated, his instincts were to just fire everybody who was investigating him.
Good evening. The country tonight is in the midst of what may be the most serious constitutional crisis in its history. The president has fired the special Watergate prosecutor, Archibald Cox. Richardson's deputy, William Ruckelshaus, has been fired. Agents of the FBI, acting at the direction of the White House, sealed off the offices of the special prosecutor. All of this adds up to a totally unprecedented situation, a grave and profound crisis.
It was called the Saturday Night Massacre, and he just kept firing people until he found someone who was willing to stop the investigation. All made possible because the flaw in the Constitution that the president and his or her administration can just fire the people who are investigating them. And that's why we need a fourth branch of government. The fourth branch would be an oversight branch of government and would give constitutional protections to inspectors general and, like in the case of President Nixon, special prosecutors. Special prosecutors are kind of like inspectors general, just more powerful and more targeted. Those inspectors and prosecutors would have to be nominated and confirmed and could be removed with the impeachment process that we use for federal judges. They'd get a fixed term, those sweet constitutional powers, and the nomination would come with a scope of investigation that they'd have to stay within. The key thing here, and why this group of people becomes a fourth branch of government, is because they can't just be fired by the people they're investigating. What a new branch of government would do would be to make those essential functions of government oversight and investigation and make them truly independent. If you think that a fourth branch of government is as sexy as I do, you can like and subscribe to The Context. If you want to get weird, you can contribute to our Patreon. If you're feeling really, really weird, you can put a bid in for the Glenn Fine playing card NFT or one of the other fourth branch NFTs available on Rarible.com. I'm not the first person to use the words fourth branch of government. Opponents of the 1978 Ethics in Government Act called the special prosecutors created by that bill the fourth branch. People refer to the American people, to news media, and the deep state to fourth branches of government. If it would be helpful, I can follow up on how all of those fourth branches of government are very different or just different from the fourth branch that I've just outlined here. We take for granted that the United States is the oldest democracy in the world, and that's after an active history of maintaining and improving upon the democracy that we inherit. Along the way, we've struggled to make independent the essential function of overseeing the government.
Nothing like this has ever happened before.
Ronald Reagan replaced all of the inspectors general on day one.
Without inspectors general, presidents and their supporters could get away with the most abominable fraud and abuse.
George W. Bush raised some eyebrows with how he handled a NASA inspector general, for instance.
Presidents don't like this. They don't like somebody with the disinfectant of daylight exposing what's going on in the government.
President Obama had been in office for only a handful of months, and at that point, he abruptly fires the Inspector General, Gerald Walpin.
We need watchdogs to make sure that the taxpayers' money is not wasted.
And throughout our history, America has tried solutions that fit within the current checks and balances. But if history tells us anything, it's that three branches of government simply isn't enough.